Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And now, with no further ado, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. Last few weeks, we've certainly placed a lot of focus on the internal political dynamics. I thought today we'd focus a little bit more on diplomacy and what exactly is going on with this new government, a government which, as we've spoken about, it has major ideological differences between the various parties, between the various leaders, especially in the diplomatic and security arenas. So let's focus a little bit on the diplomatic. And I'd just like to sort of take us back a little bit to the Netanyahu era. During the Netanyahu era, 12 years, it could be argued, and this is something that I said quite a number of times, that Israel's parliamentary democracy, where prime minister is the first amongst equals in a cabinet, was largely left behind to a certain extent and replaced with something closer to a presidential system. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that over the years, Netanyahu took control very much of almost every decision, every major decision in the state of Israel, whatever arena was in. He made sure that his ministers knew that he had to take credit. If there was a big press conference on the opening, the launching, or success or achievement, he was very much involved, gave the impression, and it was more the impression, it was the reality that he was very much involved and no major decisions could be taken without him. That was no more keenly felt, arguably, than in the diplomatic arena, arguably since 2015, when Avigdor Lieberman left the position of foreign minister. There hasn't been a powerful foreign minister who has led an independent or semi-independent, has been given the right to lead on diplomatic issues. If we look at some of the characters that were foreign ministers, a lot of them were either beholden to Netanyahu or sort of sidelined to a certain extent, and diplomacy was certainly led by Netanyahu pretty much across the board. What this government is trying to do, will have to do, just because of the reality and the nature of the makeup of it, each minister obviously will have to coordinate with the larger cabinet, but will have a large amount of autonomy. Certainly our current foreign minister, who's also the alternate prime minister, Yair Lapid, will have greater autonomy than any foreign minister probably in a decade, largely because he represents the head of the largest party. He is the alternate prime minister, and it was agreed very much up front that, to a certain extent, this is an oversimplification, but for the purposes of the discussion, to a certain extent, Naftali Bennett is in charge or leading, let's say, on internal issues, and Yair Lapid is leading on external issues, relations abroad. And that's certainly a sea change from what we saw under previous governments. And that has meant that Yair Lapid, who's certainly to the left of Naftali Bennett on a lot of diplomatic and security issues, has been the face that has been seen, if not personally, certainly in conversations with Washington, with Brussels, and many other capitals around the world. What we've seen with this new sort of setup is certainly a new adjustment, a reset, let's say, in Israel's relations with certainly the West. Not to say that I would argue that Yair Lapid, Naftali Bennett, even Benjamin Netanyahu hold drastically different issues on some of the major challenges. On Iran, on the Iran agreement, on the JCPOA, I don't think there's too much daylight in how they see it. On the Palestinian issue, while Lapid is more of a supporter of a two-state solution, he's also of the mind that it can't happen at the moment because of the realities, specifically the Palestinian leadership. And on many other issues in the diplomatic arena, there's not too much daylight. But what there is an emphasis on the way diplomatic relations are being held. In diplomacy, there's the art of saying no. Netanyahu was far more blunt about saying no. He said no to the JCPOA under Barack Obama, famously speaking in Congress against the wishes of the administration, and sort of, to a certain extent, if I want to be blunt, thumbing his nose to a certain extent at certain governments around the world, especially on the Iran issue. We saw that the JCPOA went ahead, obviously, when there was a more favorable administration under the Trump presidency. They left the JCPOA, but it's clear that one of the legs of the Biden presidency is to return to the JCPOA in one form or another. What the Lapid diplomatic plan has done, rather than saying no, because he's come out and said on many occasions he's against the JCPOA and the return of the Americans to the JCPOA, their plan has been not to say no, but to say yes, but. And that's been also on the Palestinian issue and pretty much other issues. In diplomacy, they kind of lead to the same place, no and yes, but it's done in a more artful way. What I mean by that is, when you say no to everything, the other side just sort of shuts itself off to a certain extent, closes its ears and understands this is not someone we can work with, it's not someone we can compromise too much with. Lapid's art of sort of saying yes, but to the JCPOA means that I wouldn't go as far as to say he has a seat at the table, but they certainly are more inclined to listen to Israel's concerns. And we've seen that by some of the high-level meetings that's taken place recently. On another level, Yair Lapid, Foreign Minister Lapid, was in Brussels this week, and he met there a more receptive ear again. A lot of people are talking about reset. I don't think it's any surprise to say that many Western nations breathed a sigh of relief that Netanyahu is no longer in office. Part of it was ideological, part of it was personal. They didn't like the way he dealt with them, the way he did things. But certainly they saw him as an ideological block to much of what they wanted to do. And I can tell you that the discussions in Brussels were certainly under a more favorable atmosphere. What I hear from them is that the sort of, Europe, the EU and Europe in general are split up into what's been called old Europe, the Western European powers, Germany, France, the UK, etc. And then there's New Europe, which is the Visegrad countries, many of the countries that were under part of the former Soviet Union, Czech Republic, Hungary, etc. And those were countries that Netanyahu certainly created very good relations with, and they became his sort of blocking force within the EU, because as we know, the EU likes to do everything together, have a unified voice on its foreign policy. Obviously, it's not always able to. So if you can manage to peel away one or two countries, then you can block the harshness of certain resolutions and policies, certainly, as it were, towards Israel. But what we did also hear from the meetings in Brussels is that there's still some very powerful countries from, let's say, old Europe that still believe a two-state solution is around the corner. Now, again, it should be clear that Yair Lapid is not antagonistic to a two-state solution. He still believes that that is the end game, that the Palestinian state is the best solution to the conflict. But he, like most Israelis, does not believe that it's possible at this point, partly because of the Palestinian Authority led by Mahmoud Abbas, and because of the reality in the region. But unfortunately, there's still these voices coming from old Europe that still believe that Israel should be offering a Palestinian state on all of the territory over the Green Line yesterday. So that's obviously going to be a great challenge. But certainly there is a new atmosphere in the international diplomacy. And yeah, Lapid is certainly trying to move ahead and trying to take advantage of that. And Naftali Bennett is taking a step back. Where there was a bit of problem was on Tisha B'Av, which is the 9th of Av, which is the saddest day in the Jewish calendar, where Jews around the world mourn the destruction of the two temples, which took place on Sunday. Many Jews want to go up to Temple Mount to really bring an actualization to their mourning. And there's nothing rare about that. I think there was about 1,500 Israelis who wanted to go up. But there was calls amongst the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, and other players to try and get as many Palestinians up on the mount as possible, to try and block this, to try and create problems. They knew about this. This is nothing new, Jews going up. But what has been new in recent months is the fact that Jews who are legally, or let's just say under the agreement with Jordan, no non-Muslims are allowed to pray on the mount. They're allowed to visit during certain times. They have to be under police escort, etc. But there's been stories in recent years of someone even mumbling a couple of words and being detained by the police. So the fact that Jews are now sort of under the radar allowed to pray, I don't know exactly what format. I myself have not gone up. I know some people who have, but the fact that the police are being far more liberal with allowing some of the Jewish prayer means that the situation is changing, perhaps with a nod and a wink. As we know, Jordan are the custodians to a certain extent on the Temple Mount, and anything that happens there, they become very, very involved. And basically, after there was some sort of conflagration between the Arabs who were there and the Jews, or the police, I would say rather, Naftali Bennett, Prime Minister Bennett, put out a statement where he talked about the right of Muslims to go and visit and to pray, and he also said that there's also freedom of prayer for Jews. Now that set off a firestorm abroad and at home. Basically, you can imagine the Jordanians really went mad about this. The Turks always looking for an opportunity to try and place themselves into the issue of Jerusalem, but also even internally, Ram, the Islamist party within the government, also made its feelings known on that. And we saw not too long after that a sort of walk back by the Prime Minister where he said he didn't mean freedom of worship, he meant freedom to visit. But what we do know is much of the calming down in the region, especially with the Jordanians, took place under the guise of Foreign Minister Yair Lapid. So we saw how this government can get itself into trouble with the disparate voices, but there seems to be a mechanism that seems to be able to work where, as I said, Naftali Bennett deals very much with what's going on at home, and Yair Lapid tries to sort out the diplomatic sphere. And there was a lot of commentators who were sort of aghast that Naftali Bennett wasn't involved directly in the discussions with Jordan and others. America obviously got involved and others, and it was led by Yair Lapid. But that really should be the natural way of things. The foreign minister should lead on that. But we've just become so used to the prime minister becoming all-encompassing that we expect our prime minister to be all-encompassing. So we have to get used to this new reality. I know my time is running out before questions, and I want to give you lots of time for questions, but I think it'd be remiss if I didn't mention the whole event surrounding Ben & Jerry's. So what actually happened? We've heard about Ben & Jerry's decided to boycott Israel. What actually happened? And it's actually quite complicated because there are many layers to this. Ben & Jerry's was bought out by Unilever a number of years ago, but the Ben & Jerry's in Israel is under a contract, has been under contract for 25, 30 years under a local distributor. And in fact, they even make it locally. I believe it's one of the only places in the world where Ben & Jerry's is made. But the Ben & Jerry's board, which is supposed to be independent from Unilever, is run by someone who apparently, according to her Twitter feed at least, is rabidly anti-Israel and is a supporter of the BDS movement. And a year and a half ago, they voted to boycott at least Israel over the Green Line and wouldn't allow any selling of their products over the Green Line. What they wanted to do, apparently, is actually even perhaps even not sell their products in Israel at all. And they became, the Ben & Jerry's board in America became very incensed when Unilever put out a press release in their name saying, we are not going to be selling anymore over the Green Line, but we are going to be continuing in Israel. Apparently that part of the sentence incensed them. As I said, run by some very left-wing elements, led by someone who has, at least on their Twitter feed, who has expressed support for the BDS movement. That left the Israeli distributor high and dry. They still have another year and a half left of it, but it's unclear exactly what will happen. What is important from going back to the diplomatic arena is Yair Lapid has tried to, again, also through the Israel's ambassador to Washington, Gilad Ardan, has written, they've written to the governors of all states which have anti-BDS laws. There are, I believe, something like 30 states which have laws which outlaw and ban they basically can take measures against a company which take the line of boycotting Israel, or, I mean, that depends from state to state, also including territories that Israel holds, which means over the Green Line. So what Israel is doing is trying to, bring these laws up and saying to these governors, Ben and Jerry's with this particular action are contravening this law, and action needs to be taken. It's very unlikely they're going to suddenly ban Ben and Jerry's from a whole state. But Unilever has, there are many pension funds within these states that are invested in Unilever. So there is quite a lot of leverage that can be used. And we saw a couple of years ago, I believe it was now, that Airbnb also tried to do something similar and said that they would not list any of its properties in Jewish settlements. And after quite a big outcry, but most importantly, this legal route was taken, Airbnb had to sort of backtrack and continues to this day to list properties in the settlements because of the threat of legal action. So it will be interesting to see what happens. There's a lot of commentary around this, whether they will backtrack like Airbnb or whether there is ideologues there who actually has control of this issue. So it's a real test case. The BDS, the anti-Israel crowd is seeing this as a big victory. And they really believe that this is their sort of first major victory after the Abraham Accords, which gave them a big loss, which really put them on the back step. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions on this or any other topics.
Thank you so much. I have to admit I had a pint yesterday before seeing the news. So I guess on that topic, Anthony Field asked, should I stop eating Ben& Jerry's?
It's a good question. There's a debate here in Israel, and the first reaction was, throw it away. We saw pictures of Avigdor Lieberman with a different ice cream. We saw what's her name, another minister throwing it in the trash. In Israel, it's basically considered good to buy Ben& Jerry's because it is a distributor who actually fought with Ben& Jerry's to make sure that he could continue selling all over Israel, including over the Green Line. And that's why he lost his contract, apparently. So a lot of Israelis are saying we should support the local distributor. Now abroad, that's under Ben& Jerry's, the international company. So I'm not going to tell anyone what to do. It's all a personal particular preference. But a lot of Israelis are saying we should buy Ben& Jerry's in Israel because we help the Israeli distributor who fought not to have any part of Israel boycotted, but internationally that's run by a board which is chaired by a woman who is deeply anti-Israel. But again, I'm not going to make any decisions for any particular individual on that issue.
Thank you. And a follow-up question on that is from Arlene Roman. Will Israeli authorities revoke the kosher certification on Ben& Jerry's ice cream?
Again, the issue in Israel is that people want to support the distributor. There are people who still haven't quite understood the whole ins and outs, but more and more they're trying to find ways. Interestingly enough, there are some. I saw an Australian kashrut authority basically remove its kashrut, which actually is less meaningful because the kashrut actually comes from America, so it's kosher anyway. I see some stores in New York and elsewhere around America have kosher stores or stores run by Jews or Israelis have basically said that they will no longer or severely limit their sales of Ben & Jerry's. But in Israel, as I said, any boycott hurts the Israeli factory, hurts Israeli citizens who, that's their bread and butter. And in a year and a half, they don't even know what they're going to do. So there's a push now in Israel to buy Ben & Jerry's, but they say abroad, it's a whole different question.
Thank you. So we have quite a few questions coming in on that, but I'll switch gears here. Rabbi Joel Schwartzman asks, can you comment on the missiles that were fired from Lebanon?
Not too much, except for what was in the public arena. We still don't know exactly. The assumption is that it was Palestinian groups. I saw someone report that because it was exactly in the time of prayer near a festival, then it wouldn't be in a religious group like Hezbollah, whereas it's probably more likely to be a secular Palestinian group. You know, whether this happens without Hezbollah's knowledge is unlikely. Hezbollah does basically control the south of Lebanon. And again, we know that Hezbollah doesn't act too much, certainly not with actions like that without Iran. But we don't know exactly. No one has taken, to the best of my knowledge, no one has taken credit for it. But from what I've read, it seems to be Palestinian groups which also have a presence in Lebanon.
Thank you. From Stephen Orlow, what is the reaction to Lapid conflating anti-Semitism with all forms of bigotry and racism?
That definitely got a lot of pushback, especially on the opposition side, amongst Likud and people like that. They felt that there is a certain unique element to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism isn't just another form of racism or discrimination, and we played into our enemies' hands by just basically saying it's just on the same level as other discriminations and shouldn't be seen as unique or separate to. So it got a lot of pushback from that, even on the sort of more, let's just say, moderate right on that. So again, like everything that's happening in Israel, there's a massive partisan nature to it, regardless of where some of the parties would be without this government. There seems to be very much anything the coalition does is attacked by the opposition and vice versa.
Thank you. So we have a question in, I am appalled by Israel's decision to sell its cell phone spying technology at all, much less to dictatorships around the world. What exactly is the Israelis' thoughts on this matter?
So first of all, it should be understood this is not the state of Israel. These are private companies which are selling technologies to countries, and then these countries, apparently, from my understanding, are using these technologies not according to the agreements. The agreements that they signed with some of these companies, and NSO, which has made the news, is certainly not the only one. They basically have agreements with some countries. Listen, if you're only going to sell to liberal democracies, then you've got a much closer, I'm not justifying it, but I'm just saying a much smaller client base. But what they do is they have agreements with these countries, these security firms. And again, these are private individuals who sell these technologies, and they sell them to these countries, these leaderships, these regimes. And the agreements are that they will only use them for certain purposes, but obviously from what we've seen in the news in recent days, it seems that some of these countries have gone over and beyond. But again, I think it's unfair to say that this is only Israelis doing it. I know for a fact that there are many Americans, many Europeans, many others who are doing it. Israel is seen as a market leader because Israel has a very sophisticated, high-tech security, intelligence element to it. So a lot of people, when they leave the army, they leave intelligence, they leave the security apparatus, they have a great understanding. And so they are very well respected in that field around the world. And the overwhelming majority of them are completely legitimate and don't get involved with any shady stuff. In this particular situation, we still don't know exactly what's happening. I'm sure there'll be many investigations, but it's really important to state that this is not the state of Israel. These are not any officials. These are not any government people. These are not people who are currently in the army or intelligence. These are private individuals.
Understood. Thank you for making that distinction. From Carrie Hildebrand, why did the campaign to vaccinate all Israelis between 12 and 18 years old peter out after about 40% of the population was vaccinated?
There's a number of reasons. First of all, when it was first launched, we didn't have the Delta variant as strong. So a lot of people were sort of thinking to themselves, parents, why do I need to take this risk, even though there's absolutely tiny minimal risk? But why take it when A, children don't get ill, and B, it seems like we're fighting or ending coronavirus. There is a feeling amongst young people, as it is all around the world, wherever they're vaccinating youth, that they are indestructible. that they don't need this. And the facts, to a certain extent, bear that out. Not to say they don't need it, because there are rare occurrences where young people do get coronavirus in a bad and serious way, but it's, again, tiny decimal points of the population. And it's quite simply, I mean, there's about 40%, I believe, of that population, which isn't terrible. And each day there are a few thousand more. I myself, just to give my personal thing, I got my two children within that age bracket. It's actually 12 to 15. I think you said 8 to 15. It's 12 to 15. I got my two kids within that age bracket vaccinated. They're now fully vaccinated. I decided it was the best thing to do. But I think it's a combination of people thinking that they don't need it, that the risk is just outweighed by the risk of potentially some of the side effects. And I think kids being kids, I think there's a big part of that. They really did try and get them to vaccinate. They try to get all celebrities, singers to try and get them to vaccinate. But at the end of the day, if there's no force vaccination in Israel. So every person makes the choice, whether it's a parent themselves or the children. And that's where we are today.
Sounds good. From Reuven Hawk, how would you rate Yair Lapid's job as foreign minister to date?
Well, the government's only been around, I believe, 5 weeks. So I think largely the jury's out. As I said, I personally think that the yes, but policy of diplomacy is much more effective than saying no. Someone who spent 6 years in the foreign ministry, I certainly saw that is more effective, and that will bring you to the table at least. Whether you'll be able to affect change, that's a whole other thing, because every country obviously has their own interests. At the end of the day, that's what diplomacy is about. Every country has their own interests. Whether you can make some subtle changes here and there, whether you can change policy here or there, that depends whether you're being listened to. If you're not being listened to at all, and there were certain leaders around the world who just simply did not listen to Netanyahu, I'm oversimplifying, obviously, then he's far less able to get something done. I'll give an example, which apparently is coming out today, or came out earlier, is that the Biden administration wants to reopen the consulate, the Palestinian consulate in Jerusalem, which was closed by Trump. That's something that Biden promised. That's something which he certainly would like to do. But now it seems that he's under the request from Bennett and Lapid, he's put it off at least till later in the year, according to news reports, until after the budget. Because again, this government really wants to try and put issues which are dividing issues amongst them off the back burner, at least until after the budget. Because as I said last week, all eyes on the budget. That is the primary goal at this point of this government. So any of these type of issues that can be put off until after that is certainly welcome from that point of view. One issue which I didn't mention, which is an issue which will have to be dealt with at least within the next 6 weeks, is the dismantlement of Khan al-Ahmar. It's a Bedouin encampment that was created relatively recently, and the Supreme Court said that it can and should be dismantled. It was built illegally. The Netanyahu government kept on saying that it will dismantle it and didn't. And the Supreme Court kept on saying you have to. It now ruled today that this is the last delay it's giving, and a decision has to be taken within the next week's week. And that's going to be very difficult because, as you can imagine, Ram, the Islamist party, is very against it. So they're going to really have to work very, very hard to try and find some solution there to get out of that, because that could really inflame the government. Again, I don't think it will bring the government down, but it certainly is a major obstacle that's coming up.
And real quick on that, Ron asks, since you brought up Ron, sorry, question from Ron, question about Ram. How much control will the Arab Party of the major bloc, I know they're supporting from the outside, but how much control will they have over national policies, particularly Temple Mount and mosque noise issues?
Ram is in the government. If you're talking about the joint list, that's outside the government. I assume you're talking about Ram. Ram is a part of the government.
Yes, sorry, just the Arab parties.
Right.
Support.
So there's only one Arab party in the government. The other joint list is outside of the government. Ram, again, I think it's not going to be a major player, a major decider on some of these issues, but it is one that has to be consulted, and the government knows that it has to find a compromise because, as I've said many times, this coalition is on a knife edge. It's 61, so the Ram party is 4 seats. So without that, they'd have no majority for anything. So every party has to be worked with very carefully. Their issues have to be taken into account. They have to be consulted. So in that respect, they certainly will get a big say. But obviously they won't have it their own way because there are many other parties which also have their issues and have their ideologies and their policies. So far, as I've said before, on the whole, amongst the leaders, it's worked quite well. There have been good compromises. There's been a few setbacks, but those are largely individual and certain mistakes. This is to a certain extent teething issues of a government where people, the vast majority of which have never been in the government, a large part of the coalition have never even sat in the Knesset. So there are teething issues, there are problems. They have a coalition chairwoman who is really learning as she goes along. So there's going to be some mistakes. So I think that's really where we are. There needs to be a lot of consultation. There needs to be a lot of compromise, and each issue will really, they're going to go by issue. They have, they try to work through coalition agreements beforehand, but again, you can't sort of foresee every single issue that's going to come up. And they try and meet all the leaders of the parties every week and try and foresee what's going to happen, at least in that week, and try and come up with solutions. But again, don't forget the leader may say one thing, but then there may be other people in the party who want to make a name for themselves and may threaten or vote differently. So there's a lot of challenges. As I said, amongst the leaders, things are going relatively well. But again, any one person can decide that they're going to go against the coalition, and then they're in trouble.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Thank you again for taking time to update us this week. For our viewers, please join us Friday for the continuation of our new series featuring project directors from the Middle East Forum and specialists in their respective fields. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.